Welcome to The Trenches. I'm your host, Rob McCallum. This is our ongoing series of interviews with filmmakers from around the world. And today with us on the line, we have a filmmaker who has been around the world and then some. With me on the line today is Mr. Neil Lundy. Neil, are you there?
I am here, Rob, and thanks for having me on.
It's fantastic to touch base with you once again, Neil. You and I started working on a project in 2008, I believe. Why don't you tell people listening about that project, and we'll just kind of maybe go back and forth about some of the fun stuff with it and some of the challenges that we came across in order to make this thing a success of where it is today.
Well, the project that we worked on was a film called Birthing at Home, because my daughter got the bright idea that she wanted to have her daughter born in our house with a midwife. I thought the idea was crazy. I spoke to a very dear friend of mine who's a doctor. We went to high school together, and he said, "Don't do it." And this doctor friend of mine just lives up the street from me, thankfully, about 10 minutes away. He said, "Well, if there's any problems, call me." But thankfully, there were no problems. And I got the bright idea that I should film this thing because it's part of history in our family history. And I thought, well, I think I'd like to make a half-hour documentary out of this. And that's when I placed an ad in one of the trades. I think we're Seneca College. I want a damn good editor that can walk me through this, and that's exactly what I got in you.
Oh, that's kind of you. I thought you might going to say you wanted a damn good editor, but you settled for me.
Well, it ended up. I had the more kind of attitude, and that is I shot everything, and it was actually quite bizarre because we had two midwives in my house. We had my mother, the soon-to-be great-grandmother, and plus my wife, and of course the husband. And I just filmed everything. I had an idea of how this was going to go technically speaking. And I went to you and I said, "Rob, make sense out of this." and I must say this, though, in my experience in my career, editors tend to love me because before I go into the editing suite, I do a paper edit. And I walk in there and I'm ready. And they look at me and they say, "I can't believe you're doing this. This is manna from heaven." But the first time in my life, I went to an editor with a bunch of tapes and this idea. I said, "Rob, help."
Yeah, lucky me, I guess. Thankfully, it was a very linear process, so there wasn't much, kind of searching to do. I mean, your daughter Alexis was pregnant, and the baby came, and it's about kind of filling the story in between. So, that's kind of an A plus B equals C scenario. But I kind of want to go back just a little bit to paint the picture for what everybody's out there. And this is available to watch, I believe, via IMDb. If anybody wants to watch a version of this, like, you filmed everything. There was probably 6 hours of footage, including some interviews. You're in, I would guess that the room you're in is maybe 20 by 20, 20 by 30.
Yeah, that's right.
And there's a kiddie pool there because you guys were going to do a water birth at first because it's more relaxing for the baby.
Yeah.
And then you guys tried doing the stool approach, and that wasn't so good. And then you went to the kind of gurney bed as a result after. So you got these three kind of stations, for lack of a better word. While you're filming stuff, you've got your wife, grandma, you've got great-grandma in the room, two midwives, you got the husband, Alain, there, and your daughter. There's a lot going on in a smaller amount of room, and you're playing the role of grandpa and cameraman, trying to keep the story straight, but trying to participate in the family events. First goal is obviously, as any documentarian or journalist like yourself knows, is just to capture what's happening. But, what else is going through your mind? Like, how do you plan on telling the story? Because you got some really good shots, so you're obviously present from, a filmmaking standpoint. So maybe just walk us through that chaos a bit.
Well, I think what it was, and I have this capability in my character, because I've been in so many situations throughout my career that, okay, fine. You have to distance yourself from the emotion of it. And I'm the kind of guy that says, okay, fine, this is what the story is. Focus, focus, focus. And you go in there, you shoot it. And if you're going to get emotionally involved in it, let it happen after you finish shooting, Just sit down, have a rum and coke, cry if you have to, but just get the damn story done, and then just unwind afterwards. And that kind of ethic has served me well, because I was very, very meticulous. Okay, this shot has to be happening. I have to have it two shot, and I'm always thinking about. I was blessed one day. The first time in my career, I worked with a cameraman who was also an editor. Cameraman, editor, these guys are unbelievable, because what they do when they're shooting, they think about when they're going to be editing. It's a blessing. And I always had that in my mind. I thought to myself, well, I'm not an editor, but I thought to myself, I'm thinking of my editor. So I want to have plenty of opportunities for my editor to do cutaways and so on. So that was what was going through my mind.
Yeah, I mean, thankfully, like you said, you were thinking of the editing process, because there's a birth going on and you don't want to miss anything. You don't want to miss any one thing. And, your lead character is, the mother, and then the father, and then as it ripples down through the family. And you don't want to miss any of that conversation between the mom and the dad. But you were conscious enough to get like reaction shots from everybody else that was watching, or get like tight close-ups on like hand gestures, like where mom was gripping dad's hand and stuff like that, so that I could lay that in over like a cut there, and make it kind of a seamless transition. I know that I can talk more about the pitfalls in post. What were some of the pitfalls in just approaching the subject? What did your daughter and son-in-law Alain feel about capturing all this on film? Because you captured everything. There was nothing that was shied away from. I feel like I'm part family member, because I've seen family event going on in great detail here. So how did you approach that? How did you schedule these interviews? And when did the day come? Because it's birth. You can't. It's like the weather. It's not quite that predictable.
No, actually, in retrospect, I was quite lucky, because it happened at 2:30 in the afternoon, and this part of our house is what we call the breezeway. So the ceiling was although covered, but it was open, and it was a sunny day, so we didn't have any lighting problems. So that was a real blessing in disguise. And I did have some professional lights there, in case it happened during the night, but it wouldn't have been as effective and not as good.
Right.
My daughter and Alain, they were all for the idea. They thought, yeah, let's film this and see where it takes us. My mother, the great grandmother, she was looked at me and said, "Are you crazy?" I said, "Ma, my mother was born in 1924. I said, "Ma, you and your two sisters were born at home. This is nothing new, She looked at me and said, "Yeah, I guess you got a point there."
Yeah.
My wife thought that my daughter was crazy, and my Alexis is kind of a ballsy gal, and she said, "No, we're doing this, and that's all there is to it."
Yeah, I mean, she seems really like a strong woman, because you and I worked on another documentary where we talk about her husband a little bit more, and what he had to do to escape Rwanda and come in Canada in the first place, and that this birthing at home was going to be like a crux of that piece, kind of like an act 3, and then where's it go from there? So there's some really interesting stuff there. But you speak to the character of your daughter. It doesn't completely surprise me that she said, "Yeah, let's do it. Why not?" without a second thought. She's completely on board, and she definitely doesn't hold back on film. Even like she doesn't hold back before, during, right after the birthing process, or some of the post-birth interviews that you guys did that one day in the park. Everybody's on board, and of course that's got to make it a lot easier for you as a filmmaker when you have carte blanche. You don't have to worry about what to show, what not to show, how to approach it, and
and I think too, Rob, the end of the film was actually quite touching. This is when you're rolling credits,
right?
And I'm interviewing Alexis, and she kind of broke up there towards the end. Very, very, very touching.
Yeah, maybe you can just tell everybody what that is a little bit about. Just to hit the nail on the head just a little bit. So there's this birthing at home that takes place. Alexis gives birth. Baby's wonderfully healthy. Any shadow of a doubt that modern medicine, everybody looked down on the process. It's gone, dispelled with. Everybody's happy. We see interviews. They're like, yeah, I'd recommend this to everybody. Then we get a few personal interviews. We get one with Alain, her husband. And then the last interview we get is with Alexis. And it's kind of a walk and talk a little bit. And what hit home for you, I guess, on that?
Well, I think the thing is, I mean, Alexis is, what you see is what you get. There's no hidden agenda. And she did kind of a recap of why she wanted to do it, what she was feeling during the process, a little bit towards, she had some fears, I mean, every woman must have some kind of fear that, hey, I want everything to go okay here.
Right.
And then I guess what happened was, everything kind of caught up to her in that soundbite at the end, and she just started breaking down and crying, and she said, like that. It was just a beautiful moment.
Yeah, it was a really human kind of sentiment that she was putting out there. She was basically reflecting back, and we captured the whole thing on film. So. But she just all of a sudden hit her everything that happened. She had a daughter and it was in her home, and it was like kind of like the perfect storm of everything that she wanted and how it worked out and just where she is in her life, and she's a mother again and all those new emotions. It just kind of came to a nice head, and I couldn't think of ending it really any other way, because how do you trump that card on a piece like this?
And I know that people that have seen it, without exception, everybody that has seen that. They're just knocked out by the end, by the ending of it. They're just knocked out by it. And they walk away teary-eyed.
It's an adventure, man. I mean, like you said, it's only a half hour long, but it is a journey. I mean, just from the whole setup, what's at stake, what you're proposing to do, and then just the middle, 15 minutes where you're just, pulling and hoping and praying that things go right, and there's pain, and the reaction shots you got are of anguish and angst and hope, and then finally, boom, Jasmine's born, and then the audience can take a nice deep breath, as we get some of the reflections, and then the audience gets to really participate with Alexis, in that last moment, because everything she says, encompasses that last half hour of footage. Yeah. So. I mean, like, some of the pitfalls that I experienced in post was, how much do we show? Because, like I said, you gave me like 6 tapes, so there's like 6 hours of stuff. I mean, we could have easily made this an hour. So it was between you and me finding that magic spot of footage. I mentioned that there was the kiddie pool at first, the stool, and then the bed. So structurally, that kind of made sense to me to go from like A, B to C as far as location, and try to wait that out a bit. But I don't remember too much back and forth between you and I. But the writing process, in a lot of documentaries, find this when you go back and you do the narration. That's what I think really informed a bunch of the choices we made before the film was finalized. Do you remember the whole narration process?
Yes. Yeah. Well, the narration process. I've got a very good friend of mine, Paul DeCourcy. Paul DeCourcy was a newsreader at CHFI, one of the radio stations here in Toronto, and he's retired now, and he's got his own studio. So I called Paul up. He just lives not too far from me, and I said, I got to get this recorded, and I got to get it done today. And I don't like doing narrations like this under the gun,
right?
Because what happens is that the voice tends to go an octave higher. And you can sense kind of, shall I say, an emotion in the voice. But anyway, I did it, and because I had to get it done, too sweet. But in retrospect, I wish I had have either done it a day earlier or a day later. But I was under the gun, and nonetheless, it was done, and Paul was very accommodating for me. In retrospect, too, I'm wondering if I should have done it. I'm wondering maybe I should have gotten Paul DeCourcy to do it, because he would have been dispassionate.
Well, okay. I mean, I'll try to separate myself from the fact that I know you and that we work together. I think you really have a nice voice that lends itself to voiceover. I don't know Paul's voice and stuff, but I like that there is a little bit of connection between you and the material, because it comes across in the voice. It is, a little confusing that you don't identify yourself as Grandpa and the narrator. I mean,
Yeah.
the audience, picks up on it implicitly when you're in the interview. We're interviewing Grandpa, which is the only time Grandpa really appears on camera. But it's not much
Yeah.
of, it doesn't detour from the value of what's going on. But I think,
Yeah.
but I think it adds. I mean, I really think you made the right choice in hindsight to do it, because I think it would have been more, you would have done more takes, getting somebody else to kind of really tune in with what was going on, and you bring a
Yeah.
you bring a warmth, to color the scenes.
Rob, you just said something that has never occurred to me before. I'm wondering if it would have been better if I had have said, "and my daughter Alexis."
I
That's a
yeah, I don't know. I mean,
good point.
this I guess the other thing we should tell everybody that's listening in is we started this like in the spring of 2008. Well, you were in Toronto and I was living in Oakville, and we met and stuff. And then I ended up moving to Texas in August, and we were still doing the editing process at that point. So by the time that narration and stuff came around, we were separated not only by, borders, but like 3,000 miles and time zones. And now I'm in Vegas and you're still in Toronto. So there's a little bit of that going on. So it's not like we could just meet for coffee and have these kind of debates, or these talks and discussions on what would work. There wasn't much plug and play time, because I know you wanted to rush this out to market because you were pitching people it already. And it was just a matter of, when's it going to be done? When can I see it? When can I start pushing it out there?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess the next question is, because I really don't know, because of the distance, how did Alexis and Alain react to the project? And I know you said the general reaction from other people that seen is they're tired and they're worn out at the end and they're teary-eyed. But what was it like for them to see their event, their moment on film?
Oh, they loved it. They just absolutely loved it. And I mean, Alexis was aware. I said, "Look, the birthing programs that I had seen before were too antiseptic."
Right.
I mean, let's face it, birthing is a messy business, and it's filled with screaming and sometimes foul language coming from the mother. And, and I thought, this is life in the raw. We got to show it as it is. And she said, "Fine." So, they were thrilled with it. Absolutely thrilled.
Well, that's great. I mean, like I said, because of the time zones and just the difference of schedules, I hadn't really been able to touch base and see how the reaction was. But the silver lining to this project is, despite some of the small hiccups, and we were probably blessed that we didn't have anything monumental, other than what happened recently when we got a sale through the distributor, and they're like, "Great, we got a sale. We sold it to what was the territory that bought it?
Argentina."
So Argentina buys the product, which is great. A half-hour short documentary getting sold is like a monumental kind of success in my books, because most people want a full feature or a doc series in a half-hour length. They're like, "Okay, so just give us the broadcast quality version," and you call me up, give me the good news, of course. And you need the broadcast version. And then there was a little bit of like, well, I'm pretty sure we gave the distributor the broadcast version so that we didn't have to worry about this. But then the bottom line was they didn't have it, and we had to get it to Argentina. So I plugged my drive in, and all the footage is gone. The entire drive won't read whatsoever. But thankfully, because I'm a smart editor, like those guys at Seneca College that you tried to get, I keep a backup of all my project files of everything that I've ever done on a separate drive. And for everybody out there who doesn't work in post, that basically means I have one file, and when I open it, it'll say, "Okay, where's all the footage?" And all I got to do is point to the footage for it. You sent me down a drive. I plugged everything back in. I had to do a little bit of fudging here and there, but more or less, we got it all back online. We had it exported. We had everything on an FTP, and we're off to the races. And we got a sale, so that's huge. And with that sale under your belt, and other things going on between when you first started and now, you're working on another major project that evolved from something that you started, way back like 10 years ago.
Yeah.
What's that project? And
well, the project was I had just because I spent 17 years of my career living in Europe, and they were halcyon days, that's for sure. But it was time for me to come home, and I came home, and I met up with a guy who was a filmmaker in France, and we come up with this idea about, because the year 2000 was coming up, and came up with the idea about doing a 10-part documentary on the great peacemakers of the world from 1900. Now, each episode, we reckon we would tell up to 15 stories. It's very, very fast paced. No talking heads, because mostly talking heads annoy me. There would be some recreations, and it was mostly archive driven. So I thought, this project is so monumental. It just financially beyond my means. So, as luck would have it, the Canadian government at the time, this would be about 1998 or 1998 probably, they were calling for centennial projects. And they were going to give grants away for people who had a centennial project. So I came up with this project. I filled out the forms, which I hate filling out forms. And I fired it off to Ottawa, the capital of Canada. And much to my unbelievable surprise, I got a call one day from the government of Canada saying that I was awarded a $1 million grant to do this project. And I remember picking up the phone and listening to this guy. And I said, what? He said, well, congratulations. You'll get the official notice in the mail in a couple of days, but you got a $1 million grant.
And that's huge. I mean, we should tell everybody, because this is an American-based show, or we think most of our listeners are American, or at least 50-50. Everybody south of the border, getting $1 million in Canada is like amazing. It's like you could retire for life and make movies forever. So it's like a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity.
Well, then I got the notification a couple of days later, and then I had to marshal the troops. And this ended up being a researcher's, if you are a researcher, this is paradise for you. But just logistically, it was just a logistical nightmare. First of all, I had to get researchers, and luckily I had my dear sweet Michelle DeMeyer, and she organized everything for me. At one point, we had 23 researchers in South America, Europe, and parts of Asia working on this project. Just getting researchers. Who are these peacemakers? What did they do? And so on. And of course, we ended up getting a mountain of all this information. We have American peacemakers, Ralph Bunche, for example, and the list goes on and on and on. We got a Japanese man who tried to stop the war between Japan and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. So the list goes on and on and on. So I got all this information and all this assembled stuff. And VHS tapes, cassette tapes and testimonials, and actual newspaper clippings from the time, whether it be 1903 or 1910, and plus all this historical footage. This was unbelievable. Well, I had made my commitment to the Canadian government because they want, and justifiably so, they wanted a deliverable. That means that, hey, listen, guys, the auditors came, which was part of the deal. The auditors came, they went over the books, and they checked out, make sure that there was no funny business with the money. And they checked out the office, and they had all the material. We shipped it down to Ottawa. The deputy prime minister at the time was Eric Nielsen. Eric Nielsen, by the way, his brother was the actor Nielsen. What's his name? What's that guy's name from Airplane?
Oh, Leslie Nielsen.
Yeah, Leslie Nielsen. Yeah, Leslie Nielsen's brother was the deputy prime minister of Canada. Anyway, he come up and he went through everything we had. He said, "Thank you very much, Neil. You've done a good service to your country," and blah 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 blah. We shook hands and so on. And then I thought, well, you got to do something with this stuff, man. Like, we got to do a documentary. So I started working on the 10-part series, and I went around to broadcasters, and the broadcaster said, 10 parts is too much for us to handle. Can you cut it down to 5? And I thought, well, yeah, I can do that. So then I went out. It's a project that everybody loves. Everybody loves this project. Like, it's never been done before. It's telling about the good things in humanity, the good guys out there, and the good women too, by the way. There was a woman from Kingston, Ontario, who had a 19-point plan to end the First World War. Julia Grace Wales was her name, and nobody would listen to her. And then Woodrow Wilson got wind of this, and he ended the First World War, and he stole all his points to end the First World War. He stole it from Julia Grace Wales, from Kingston, Ontario, Canada, and never gave her credit, by the way. Anyway, so that's how it goes. So then I thought, well, I'm having a bit of a problem flogging this. So I got a hold of a Catholic Jesuit priest, Father John Deere. Now, I'll tell you who John Deere is. Father Deere, for those of you who are not Catholic, he's a Jesuit, and the Jesuits are at the top of the ecclesiastical food chain. And I can quite safely say that the Vatican historically has always been afraid of Jesuits because Jesuits think. They're known for their brains. And they think and they challenge. The Vatican is afraid of them. Father John Deere, was friends with the Berrigan brothers. Now, the Berrigan brothers were two other Jesuit priests, and during the Vietnam War era, the Berrigan brothers and John Deere were chaining themselves to the fence at Pennsylvania Avenue, protesting against the Vietnam War. And John Deere continued his peace efforts, and in fact, he was nominated by Desmond Tutu for the Nobel Prize in Peace. John Deere is still alive, lives in New York. Anyway, he called me up one day and he says, Neil, what you need a name attached to this. He says, write this telephone number down. It's a fax number. Give him a one-pager and tell him what you want to do. I said, okay, fine. So I wrote up this and I faxed it away, and the fax number was to Martin Sheen. And about, I'd say, less than an hour later, my phone rang. It was Martin Sheen. He said, Neil, I just talked to Father Deere, Father John Deere. He said, John and I have known each other for years. And he said, this has got to be done. I'll do the narration for you. Let me know when and where I'll be there. So he's a great supporter of this project. Another guy, too, I got in touch with was Gino Vanelli. And Gino, he says, well, look, because I faxed him and we talked on the phone. He said, I'll be in Toronto because Gino now lives in Oregon. And Gino he's refocused his career because, as many of you probably know, he was a big rock star in the 70s. But now he's doing more, shall we say, classical work. He just finished doing an album with Montserrat Caballé, who is an opera singer. He did it with the London Philharmonic Orchestra. So Gino and I met, and Gino says, I like this project. I want to be involved in it. And he wrote the theme music for The Wounded Dove. So I've got all this, and this is a very unfortunate word I'm about to use when you're dealing with peace, but I have this ammunition, so to speak, in my quiver, and we're trying to get this done. But here's the problem. Herein lies the rub. It's an expensive project. $1 million is actually $1.3 million has already been spent on it. But to get it finished, it's going to cost $2 million. How do you do it? How do you do it? Well, the only way I see it getting done is that we've got to have participation from the Germans, the Americans, the Brits, and we'll get a Canadian sale too. Now, the $2 million is a bit of a misnomer because, as you know, Rob, here in Canada, we have different funding agencies that shall I say, help out the bottom line in the budget.
Yes.
We've got, the Rogers Cable Fund. We've got tax credits and so on and so forth. So the $2 million budget probably realistically is somewhere in the neighborhood of maybe 1.5 and around there.
Yeah.
But the thing is, Rob, the challenge is to get everybody at the table. And I'll just arbitrarily say maybe the BBC in London, ZDF in Germany, either a production house or one of the cable networks in the States, and say, okay, guys, we're all here. Let's open up the pocketbook and let's get on with this.
Well, I think it's a really interesting project. And like you said, you do have a lot of feathers in your cap on that one. To me, I think you should be, spend a little bit of cash and go out to something like the Banff International Television Festival, where you can meet with the BBC and say, look, this is what I got, or go to some other pitch fests that are out there and just lay it all out on them. I mean, you can make 20 to 30 minute appointments with them, and it'll be done. Of course, anybody out there that's listening, if you think that you can help get this project off the ground, get in contact with me, and I'll shuttle the details back and forth with Neil and see if it's a good match. I think you're right, Neil. I think there is a bit of a no-brainer aspect to it. How has this not been done yet? And to have somebody like Martin Sheen come on board and basically be the voice of the project, both literally and physically, it just makes it all that much easier to push down the road.
Yeah, and I think too that the other interesting aspect of this project is that this tells peacemaker stories from all over the world. Like we got peacemaker stories from Burma, from Germany, from like some of the stories will break your heart. Like I had never heard of most of them before. Like we got like one story there about the White Rose, and it's about three. And I'll just briefly give you a summary of this, but it's about three university students as Hitler was rising to power. Recognized this man was truly evil, and they used to leave notes in telephone booths, in train stations, and everything, saying what a horrible man this guy was. And the SS were after these guys, and the Gestapo. They didn't catch them for over a year, and they got the three of them. It was a brother and sister. They were executed, beheaded, by the way, and a couple of university professors beheaded, and one guy escaped and ended up moving to Los Angeles and became a heart surgeon. And I actually met him. Jürgen Wittenstein is his name. And I interviewed this guy. I mean, like you're touching history here. It's just an unbelievable story. Interestingly enough, many years ago, the Germans did a story on the White Rose, and they won an Academy Award for Best Foreign Picture, called The White Rose.
And now this guy's just in LA, you've met him, and his story, other than the Academy Award, is just going to be forgotten unless this kind of gets out and brings him back in the spotlight a little bit.
Absolutely.
Well, let's maybe put our heads together and find other ways just even to get the word out on this project, even if it's like a Kickstarter campaign or an Indiegogo campaign, and use that crowd-based source funding. Maybe you won't get, the $1.5 million that you need to get it done, but it might bring awareness to people, and that might just trigger contact. And just hit up Twitter and Facebook, and we'll post something on the Wired In Network site, which hosts this show as a podcast, and we'll try to get the gears turning for you.
And the other thing, Rob, I hasten to add, we've had written support from the United Nations, from about 7 or 8 international blue chip organizations supporting this project. I mean, the Culture of Peace, United Nations in Paris have written me a glowing letter about this project. The Pearson Peacekeeping Center in Nova Scotia. They look at this and they say, like, why isn't this on the air?
Well, we'll find a way. Again, like I said, we're going to have to find a way to bang our heads together and answer that question one way or another. You mentioned earlier that you spent 17 years of your career moving from what you're doing now to what you were doing a while ago. 17 years of your career living in Europe, and you were reporting for an entity known as the European Journal. Now, I went on YouTube, and I YouTubed your name, Neil Lundy, and I found like a whole slew of stories. Everything from marijuana and prostitution in Amsterdam to Irish moonshine to revealing who Jack the Ripper really was and major medical breakthroughs. I mean, there's got to be some interesting tales for a Canadian somewhat stranded in now what is the European Union, covering some of these racy issues. Well, why don't you tell us a little bit about what it was like to be a newsman in that area and covering those stories?
Well, I've got it's actually a bit of a bizarre story. I was working at the CBC. First of all, the CBC had put me on loan of service to the Canadian Forces Radio Television Network in Lahr, Germany. Now, Lahr, Germany is, I'll give you a geographical lesson here where it is. Lahr is sort of like beside Strasbourg, France. It's north of Basel, Switzerland by about 45 minutes.
Okay.
So anyway, I went over to Large Germany. I was going to stay there 2 years, but the CBC said if you want to stay longer, you can. So I stayed there for 6 years. And I came back to Toronto, back to the CBC, and hated it. And I was there for 10 months. And a friend of mine in the lounge one day said, let's go over to Yonge Street and have lunch. And I said, no, I don't want to go. And Yonge Street is the principal street in Toronto, and the longest street in the world, by the way. Anyway, so I went over just to shut him up, and I picked up a copy of a newspaper called The European, which I used to read. And I was reading the want ads, and they had a two-line thing: wanted anchorman for international television show applied to this box number in Frankfurt. Well, I thought, what the hell, why not? So I fired off to this box number in Frankfurt. Then I got a telephone call about a week later from Deutsche Welle, which is Germany's national broadcaster. And they said, look, we like your resume. Can you send us a tape of your stuff? And I said, yeah, sure. So I went to a good friend of mine, Avi Lev, who's an ace editor at the CBC, retired now. And I gave him, well, Rob, I'm sorry. I told you that I've only never done this. Only to you once, just gave you a bunch of tapes and helped me out. I'm sorry. I did it one other time with Avi Lev.
Okay.
I gave him a whole bunch of tapes and said, Avi, make me look good in 8 minutes.
Fair enough.
So he said, okay, fine, I will. So anyway, he cut it all together, and I sent it over to Deutsche Welle in Cologne. And they called me up and said, you are our new anchorman at European Journal. Well, I was stunned. So anyway, I went over to Cologne, and now the program is called European Journal. The program was playing in 54 countries. I mean, it was ubiquitous, including PBS. That was their chief client, PBS. And it's a weekly news magazine show, half hour. And what the premise behind the program was, it was doing European stories. Now, I'll just briefly tell you the birth of European Journal. In these days, the Berlin Wall was still up. And the East Germany were sending propaganda programs to the East Germans, but also, of course, it leaked into West Germany about how great life was in East Germany and so on and so forth. So the seat of the West German government at the time was in Bonn, just south of Cologne, a little boring town in Germany. And they said, no, we got to have our own programming that tells the East Germans how great life is in Europe. So they come up with this idea for European Journal, and they needed an anchorman. And I was the guy. Here's the bonus. There was no such thing as limited budget. They had very deep pockets because this program was funded by the West German government. I mean, as you know, West Germany is mega rich. It is certainly then at the time, and even to this day, they are the economic engine that drives Europe. And so there's no such thing as, oh, no, we can't afford to do that story. We can't afford. Oh, no. Money was no object. And that's why I got to go everywhere in Europe and do these great stories. I mean, the stories that I had one of the greatest bosses I ever worked for, God rest his soul. He passed away a number of years ago. Wolfgang Rendelsmann was the executive producer. And, I went to him and I told him, for example, I says, I got a great story, got a tip-off from a friend of mine in New York about this thing called the magic gene. And it's about this little village in Italy that was blocked. It didn't have a direct access to this village until Mussolini took power and built a road through there. But through intermarriage over the centuries, there was this gene in two of the families that prevented people from getting heart disease. It was an outstanding story. I mean, I couldn't believe it. So I went there and I shot the story. And these people can smoke and drink, eat ice cream, eat pasta, no matter what. They just don't get heart disease. So we ran it on European Journal, and I thought, this story is so damn good. I went to Global Television, one of our networks in Canada. I said, you got to run this story. The story was like 5 minutes long. And at the time, Peter Kent, Arthur Kent's brother, was the anchor man. And of course, you know how editors are. They, you know, in newsrooms, they want to cut things down to 2 minutes and 30 seconds. I said, no, the story's not available. I want it to run in its entirety. Anyway, we fought. I won. They ran it. Interestingly enough, 3 months later, 60 Minutes gives me a call, saw this story that said, this is unbelievable news. I said, yeah, no kidding. So they said, well, we want to do the story. I said, well, go ahead. He said, well, give us all your notes and then all that sort of stuff. I said, I'll tell you what I'll do. Well, who's going to do the story? He said, well, Mike Wallace is going to do it. I said, well, I'll tell you what. I'll go down to Italy with Wallace and the crew, and I'll produce it for you. And, you know, we'll shake hands and be friends. Oh, no, no, no. This is 60 Minutes. We don't have outsiders come in and do any producing for us. I said, well, you're not going to get any information from me. Sorry, I'm going to be a real jerk about this, but do your own research. And that's how that worked out. If I could just bore you with one more story.
Yeah, I mean these are great, Neil. I mean these are tales from the trenches, and that's the name of the show, The Trenches. And you know this is the color from it. So tell us another tale.
Well, I am my sainted boss, Wolfgang Rendelsman. He came to me once and he said, well. He said, Neil, if you had to do a story about the 20s, what would you want to do? I said, well, I want to do a story about the 20s in Berlin. Now, in the 20s in Berlin, it was so decadent. It was just deliciously decadent, you know? And if you think of the film Cabaret with Liza Minnelli, that's what it was like. So I contacted a friend of mine, and Randy says, well, go ahead. Now, remember now, the wall was still up. So I contacted a friend of mine, and he said, I said, you got to help me out with the story, because I want this to be kind of really something, you know? He said, well, you're locked in here because there's a woman who is 93 years old who was here during the time, in the 20s. Okay, fine. He says, come on up and meet her. You'll meet her one day. You'll talk about the story. The next day, you'll do the story. So I went up and I met this woman, 93 years old. She was, I'm 6'6", and Sonia was about 6'1", in around there. Probably used to be 6'3". Very stately woman, just immaculately dressed. So we're talking, and I said, well, you were here during the 20s. Can you tell me a bit about yourself? Sonia says, well, yes, what happened was, and she lived in this great estate, by the way, near the Wannsee, which is a lake near the Wannsee. This is where they did the final solution with Himmler about how they're going to dispose of the Jewish populations. Anyway, so she was saying, yeah, I was here in the 20s. She said, what happened was my mother was a dancer. My father was a dancer. They were both ballet dancers. He was Russian, she was German. And they met one night, they had sex, and she became pregnant. So they lived together for about 3 years, and they just couldn't make a go of a marriage. So what happened was, a woman was coming through town doing a show. Her name was Isadora Duncan. Isadora Duncan. I mean, if you don't know who Isadora Duncan is out there, folks, look her up on the internet. It'll tell you who she is, okay? She was, they did a movie about her, as a matter of fact. She was a dancer. She was avant-garde, lived in New York, had a school for children, and so on. So they knew Isadora Duncan. She was coming through Berlin, and she took Sonia and took her back with her to New York. And basically, Isadora Duncan raised her. And then Sonia Gatza moved back to Berlin. So I'm looking at Sonia, and I'm thinking to myself, you know, God, that last name, Gatza, is bothering me because I know the name. And I told her, I said, Sonia, I just can't place it. But it's familiar. She says, well, my husband was Heine Gatza. Ah, I got it. Heine Gatza is the guy that wrote the song called Calcutta. Da la 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 la. That was her husband. I couldn't believe it. So then I said, well, Sonia, I mean, you must have known all these people. Oh, she said, I knew them all. I knew them all. Bertolt Brecht, Kurt Weill. They were all in this little cabal living in Berlin during the 20s. Now, Kurt Weill, Bertolt Brecht was a dramatist, and he wrote the Three Penny Opera. The guy who did the music for the Three Penny Opera was Kurt Weill. Now, coming out of the Three Penny Opera, everybody's familiar with the song Mac the Knife. Well, Mac the Knife came out of the Three Penny Opera. So she was wired into all this. And then Sonia told me, she said, and Hitler was coming to power now. Now it's 1931, 32. And, she was seeing that some of her Jewish friends were being secreted away, never heard from them again. And she said, it's only a matter of time and they come for me. And sure enough, she said, one afternoon, it was at 4:30 in the afternoon, the Gestapo came for me, had to go down to the headquarters, and they wanted to know where certain of my Jewish friends were. And she said, I don't know a thing. And they started getting really tough with her. And she said, you're not going to touch me. You won't touch me because my girlfriend will get me out of this. Oh, really? And who's your girlfriend? Eva Braun, Hitler's mistress. Unbelievable. So then, now Sonia is living in this palatial place in Berlin. She's living with two homosexual ballet dancers. And she said to one of the ballet dancers, she said, bring over that box in the closet there. Bring that box. She brings the box out. And here's a picture of Sonia Gatza with Eva Braun shopping. They're on the Kurfürstendamm in a famous street in Berlin. They're swimming together and so on. Well, I'm sitting on the floor now as a student. And I said, well, Sonia, what happened then? She said, the Gestapo never touched me again. And I got to interview this woman. Rob, it's unbelievable.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know what part of that blows me away more. I mean, that feels like a Woody Allen movie, the way that all those forces come together. And I don't know, man. That's incredible. That's definitely some good tales that you've got from your European travels and whatnot, and really gets to the heart of the show of, getting the experience, the expertise, and you never know what's around the corner and how to get in and out of situations. Neil, I'm going to wrap up the interview, and we always wrap up the interview by playing a little game, a kind of a what-if scenario, so you can have a lot of fun with it. The first question is, you get to meet with Spielberg for 5 minutes. Say you're stuck in an elevator with him. How do you make the most of that time?
Stephen, I know you get this all the time, but I've got this story about the great peacemakers of the 20th century and the 21st century. I want you to look at this. I want you to do it, and that's what I want you to do. I pitch it.
I like it. That's the smart way to go, and he's got nowhere to run, so
right.
He can only listen to what you're saying. The second question, you can go back in time and work with anyone in history. Who is it? Why? And would you do a production with them, or would you just work on something with them?
Wow. Go back in history. What? Like, can I go back 2,000 years?
You can do whatever you want.
Yeah. I guess I'd like to go back and do Jesus Christ.
You want to do birthing in the manger?
No, I wouldn't start there. I would start when he's 30 years old, and I'd say, listen. I mean, do you really know what you're doing? I know you know what you're doing, but do you know where you're headed? And I don't think this guy, what's his name, the guy who traded him in for 30 pieces of silver, he really doesn't mean to do that, Judas. And let's work together. Let's I don't know, put you on the bill.
All right, you want to make Jesus Christ a superstar 2,000 years ago. I like it. The last question, and probably even a little bit more fun or silly, is if you could be any superhero, who would it be, why them, and how would it help your filmmaking goals?
If I could be a superhero, God, I guess I'm being chauvinistic here because I am Canadian, and out there, hey, you Americans, you got to realize that Superman was in fact a Canadian invention. The Canadians invented Superman. Okay, I'd probably want to be Superman,
But
and
that's
because I like this Clark Kent thing. I like it a lot, because you could be filmmaker during the day, and if you run into obstacles, Superman would take over at nighttime and say, "Hey, listen, you're going to produce this, buddy." I like this the Clark Kent thing.
not a bad catalyst to get people to jump on your peacemaking project when you've got the red cape flowing behind you either. I don't think.
Yeah.
Neil, it's been a great talk. Just shy of an hour here, spending time with you. Your infectious stories, your wonderful tales. I mean, I'm sitting here listening to everything that you're telling me and in our listening audience, and I know I want to work with you again on something in some capacity because there's a synergy, there's something in the air that makes me want to be with a guy like you who's seen what he's seen, who does what he does, and who's already got the next big thing in his pocket. So
the project I'm working on now is called Death Camp Diaries, and the pilot is Hitler's Revenge. It's a hell of a story.
We can sell that too. We can make that work. We'll get two nickels and rub them together. So Neil, I'll thank you again for appearing on the show. This is The Trenches. I'm your host, Rob McCallum, and you've been listening to another great show on the Wired In Network.
Thanks, Rob.